Hello, everyone. I am Ashley Ramey Craig. I am the Community Engagement and Partnership Specialist for the Library of Virginia, and I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. We're super excited to have our wonderful panelist and moderator on this program this evening. And I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Stuart Scott, and it's all to you, Stuart.
Thank you, Ashley. I'm Stuart Scott. I am a Richmond native. I'm also the Communications Director for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I'm extremely honored to be your host this evening, mainly because of the 4 outstanding guests that we have. But before we get started, I want to thank the Library of Virginia and its principals for sponsoring this online activity. Our guests tonight are Bettye Kearse, Leontyne Clay Peck, Gayle Jessup White, and Peighton Young. First, I will ask each of them to introduce themselves and maybe just give a brief mention of a special past project or some experience that they would like to share. So we will, and after that, I will ask them one question to help deepen our experience this evening. And to preserve time, we will go right into the main discussion without any interruptions, hopefully to end by 7:05, 7:10, so that we can have ample time for a Q&A. So I drew names off camera and decide this is the order that we'll start introductions with. And Peighton will be first, Peighton Young. Leontyne Peck will be next, followed by Bettye Kearse. And then we will close that part of the introductions out with Gayle White. So we'll turn the time over now to Peighton.
Hello, everybody. It is really cool to see how widespread the audience is here today. So this is really cool. My name is Peighton Young. I am a Ph.D. student at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg. I am also the site historian and genealogist for Patrick Henry's Red Hill Plantation in Brookneal, Virginia. And I primarily specialize in reconnecting Black communities, Black families, and Black individuals to their ancestors and where they were enslaved and plantations and house museums, primarily in Virginia. But I've also worked in sites in Southern Maryland and other parts of the Upper South. And I'm really grateful to be here. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for sharing your evening with us. My name is Leontyne Clay Peck, and I am a native of Piedmont, West Virginia. Have lived in Central Virginia, right outside of Charlottesville, for the past going on 21 years now. I have done research on primarily my Clay roots, my Clay family, who came descended from a person by the name of John Clay, who arrived in the Hampton Roads area in 1613. And I just completed a film, and the film's been going on tour, called Clay 1613. But I've been involved with genealogy and African-American history and culture for over 30 years. Thank you.
I'm Bettye Kearse. I'm a retired pediatrician after practicing general pediatrics in the Boston area for 31 years. But I took on a new role in 1990 when my mother turned over to me a box of family memorabilia. And receiving that box meant that it was my turn in the line of family griots, or griots, which are oral historians. So I was the 8th generation griot. And when I asked my mother, why now? She said, I wanted to give you plenty of time to write the book. And the reason she wanted me to write a book, because she was concerned that if it weren't written down that our family stories might somehow get lost, but also she wanted our story to become part of the nation's story. And when she asked me to do that, what she meant was for me to write down just the family stories. But when I did that, I realized that my story was representative of a much broader story. So I traveled to Lagos, where the transatlantic slave trade began, to Ghana, West Africa, where one of my first African ancestors in America was stolen from, to Baltimore, Maryland, where there's a replica of a slave ship, to New York City, where there's a very well-known African American, or African, sorry, it's called the African burial ground. And my book actually became a memoir, because as I learned more about what this slavery thing was, I learned more about myself.
Very good. Thank you.
Well, one more, last but not least, as they say. Hello, everyone. I am Gayle Jessup White. I am Public Relations and Community Engagement Officer at Monticello, which was the home of Thomas Jefferson, the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, as well as hundreds of enslaved people, including members of my family. Like Bettye, I am an oral historian, or I should say, I learned from an oral history that we were related to Thomas Jefferson. I learned this when I was 13 years old, growing up in Washington, D.C., many, many years ago. So you can imagine that as a young girl, a very proud Black person in D.C., I was shocked to learn that Jefferson owned people, as we were not taught that growing up in D.C. schools. So I committed then, all those years ago, to learn how, in fact, my Black family could be related to the third president of the United States. Ultimately, that led me to Monticello, here in Central Virginia, in Charlottesville, actually technically in Albemarle County, which is adjacent to Charlottesville, where I became the first descendant of the enslaved. Thomas Jefferson and his wife, I learned through one of their great-great-grandsons, and enslaved people. My family was the Hemings family. I am related to the famous Sally Hemings, and to another family, a lesser known family, the Hubbard family. Thus, I am the first descendant of the enslaved and the enslaver to work at Monticello and to be paid for it. Oh, and I should add, like Bettye, I did write a book, a memoir, recounting my 50-year journey and what I discovered in the process. And as you'll learn listening to all of us tonight, our stories are not our own. They're a reflection of the country's stories and the struggles that we have gone through to become part and recognized as part of the American tapestry, and all of our ancestors' contributions to helping make the country a success. It's not ours, it's everyone's.
Thank you. Thank all of you. Now, the audience, you can understand why I was excited to be a host here, because there's some tremendous stories here. I'm going to ask each one a selected question germane to their experience, briefly to deepen our experience with them before we get into the subject matter. And I'll start with Leontyne. I like to focus on your educational aspect of your experiences, both you as a student and as an educator, and make a comparison of how today's youth are responding to the roots aspect of our history. I think it's easy to conclude that they will get involved with the Nat Turner experience or the Marcus Garvey experience, but are they really grasping the essence of what knowing who a third great grandfather or a fourth great grandmother is, and how it relates to their life?
Thank you for the question. In 1980, I was a student and I traveled abroad, and I studied in Italy and I studied in Greece. And while we were there, I met students from Philadelphia, and one of the students there mentioned someone in history, an African American. And none of us knew, and there were 4 or 5 African Americans within this group, and no one knew the answer to it. And I immediately felt ashamed that I didn't know my history here, because the student that mentioned it was a white student, was not a Black student. And so my personal dedication from that day on, when I was a senior in college, was I'm going to learn as much as I can about my own history. And at that time, I wasn't even thinking about my family. I was thinking about American history. And so once I graduated and returned, and my degree was not in history, but I read as much as I could. And during that period, like a 10-year period of time, I ended up becoming the cultural affairs manager at West Virginia University for Black culture. So at that time, that is really when I started to teach students, but I was also teaching myself. And I felt at the time it was important to get information to younger students. You shouldn't get this history when you're in college, because it's like a shock to your spirit, to your soul. So we made a dedication. When I say me, we, I mean the community, that we would start what we called Saturday schools. For any child, you didn't have to be a Black child, for any child who was interested in learning about African American history. And we did this for several years in the community. And so my students have been kindergarten through college students. And I think now, especially the season that we're going through now in our history and in our country, it's extremely important, I believe, not to put all of the responsibilities on our educational institutions, but also with our communities to teach our children about their history. So we have to be committed. And I think the 30 years that I've done it, I believe and very confident that those students who came through our systems will be the next generation and do have a greater understanding of the contributions, not only of Nat Turner, Sojourner Truth, but the people in their own families. Those stories don't get told. So I encourage them to, talk to grandma, talk to your great aunt, and get your family stories, because those really are the stories that make the basis of what we're looking for.
Thank you. And that's the answer I need to maintain hope, because sometimes I worry about where our young people are going, but thank you for that. Bettye, you up next. And not only, I understand that not only are you a descendant of James Madison, but you also on the board at Montpelier, or the Montpelier Foundation, which is the home of the former president. So I was wondering what you could share briefly about what it means to you personally and to the public that you are where you are, and then maybe give a mention of the program, The Mere Distinction of Color.
Thank you for reminding me or mentioning that I'm a descendant of President James Madison, according to my oral history. Somehow, when I introduced myself, I didn't do that. I became a member of the Montpelier Foundation Board about 1.5 years ago. And it was at a time of transition. So I'm going to call the Legacy Board had agreed to institute what was called structural parity on the board, meaning that there would be equal representation of members of the Montpelier Descendants Committee on the board. And the Montpelier Descendants Committee is official representatives of the descendants of the enslaved people, particularly of Central Virginia. So structural parity was instituted before I came on the board. Then it was rescinded while I was on board. And after a long, very painful struggle, it was restored. And so now we have a new board that is doing what I think are some very exciting things. I'm just going to mention two of them. One of them is memorialization projects, which will illustrate to the public just how vital enslaved people were to James Madison, to Montpelier, to Virginia, to the nation, really. And that is part of that, I think, is the exhibit that you mentioned, the mere distinction of color. And another part of the board's project, or another one of the board's project, is called the Arc of Enslaved Communities. And the Arc is a 850 acre that goes from the Blue Ridge Mountains to Fredericksburg to the north. To the south is Richmond, and Montpelier is in the core of that. And this area was really vital to the founding period. And those enslaved people living and working within that area are also invisible founders. They are founders, but they have been largely invisible. What else may I say about the board? Or, yeah, the foundation or some of our projects?
Well, you can encourage everyone to go and tour Montpelier. It's a treat. And I think the board and all the others that work with them have done an excellent job. So thank you for your comments, Bettye.
Yeah, it's a beautiful exhibit, and it really humanizes enslaved people.
Exactly right. All right, Gayle, you up next, and a very simple question. Is the Sally Hemings story at peace now? Is it accepted, widely accepted?
I'd be happy to answer that question. But before I do that, I'd like to comment on what Leontyne and Bettye said. Leontyne mentioned talking to grandma, talking to the elders. It's essential that we do that. Were it not for a woman in my family, a woman we called Aunt Peachy, my grandmother's half-sister. Aunt Peachy, I never met, but she could not read, write, or spell her own name. But what she said constantly to my oldest sister, who's 20 years older than I, you're related to Thomas Jefferson. I'm not, but you are. You're descended from Thomas Jefferson. My sister heard that story as a child over and over. And it was from my sister that I heard of the connection to Thomas Jefferson. So were it not for Aunt Peachy, the only person in my dad's family who was alive in her generation and old enough to remember that story that had been passed down, we would not, you'd be having this conversation today, but I wouldn't be having it with you. So it's really important to talk to your elders. I mean, and right now I'm an elder, so I'm encouraging my own family to talk to me because I am the resource now. After 50 years of collecting these stories, I am the resource. And back to what Bettye said about the work and the mere distinction of color in particular, which is a phenomenal exhibition that really does humanize the enslaved people. And that's part of what we're here to do, humanize our ancestors. For if we don't humanize, if the public doesn't humanize them and see them as who they were, as not this monolith of people caught up in the drudgery of daily work, but people who saw themselves as mothers and sisters and fathers and brothers and skilled laborers. These were skilled laborers. These are the people who actually built Monticello and built Montpelier and built the nation's capital. If we don't see, can't see those people as humans, then how are people going to see their descendants as humans? So it's essential that that we visit places like Montpelier and Highland. Highland is Monroe's home, and of course, Mount Vernon, and any of these historic homes where people were enslaved that our ancestors helped build. So it's essential that we do that work. And I encourage people to come to Monticello, in particular, my ancestral home. And let me address your question about Sally Hemings. I don't know that we will ever be completely at peace with Sally Hemings and the ties or connection that she had to Thomas Jefferson. And for people who may not be familiar with the story, Sally Hemings was the half-sister of Thomas Jefferson's wife, Martha. After Martha died 10 years from childbirth, after 10 years with Jefferson, when he was minister in France, Sally Hemings was sent there to care for his daughters. She was 14 years old at the time. When she was 16 years old, she was pregnant with his child. She negotiated freedom for their unborn children and privileges for herself. If she would agree to come back to the United States with him, for in Paris, in France, she would have been free. She was there with her brother, James, and they both negotiated deals with Jefferson. As I mentioned earlier, Sally Hemings was my 4 times great aunt. Now, having said that, she did return to the States. All 4 of the children, she had 6 with him, all 4 who survived into adulthood were in fact freed or allowed to walk away from the plantation. After many, many years of debate and challenges and denial, and of course this relationship was known during Jefferson's time. There was in 1873, a memoir from one of their children, Madison. It had been known since they had their relationship, since Jefferson was president, that this was going on. It was not unusual on these plantations for this to happen. There's always been a lot of contention about it, particularly within the white descendants of the Thomas Jefferson legacy. I cannot speak for those descendants or for the Monticello Association, where those descendants have membership. I can, however, speak for Monticello. And in 2018, Monticello opened a groundbreaking exhibition called The Life of Sally Hemings, which completely embraced and recognized that Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, in fact, had 6 children together, that she was in Paris with him, that she negotiated with him, that she was a mother, a world traveler, a seamstress, and an emancipator. So when you come to Monticello and you visit the land that our ancestors built, you will see Sally Hemings as a complete and whole human being. So indeed, there's peace in Monticello, while there might not be peace entirely within the whole community.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Oh, that's great. I can only imagine the struggle to get at least to this point. And I think it's important that you are also working there, not just a descendant, but you're working there so you can help direct that change, if you will, in attitudes and perceptions. So.
Thank you so much. And there are actually 3 descendants at Monticello now. One is a consultant. The other is a full-time employee there. He is director of the Getting Word Oral History Project. He's also a Hemings descendant. He's one of my cousins through the Robinson family, which is related to the Hemings family. And Getting Word, just so folks know, for almost 30 years now has collected the oral histories of descendants of the enslaved community at Monticello. It was founded by a woman named Cinder Stanton, who is the patron saint, quite frankly, of Monticello's descendants. And we are very proud of the work that we've done there. And we work in collaboration with the other plantation homes, plantation museums. And I've worked with the other ladies aside from Peyton. It's a pleasure to meet you, Peyton, and I hope we get a chance to work together at some point to tell these narratives and to tell complete and honest stories of our American history.
Thank you. This discussion is becoming just as exciting as anticipated discussion for which we were called. But let's give Peyton a chance. Peyton, You mentioned that you were working on your doctorate at William and Mary, which is a fine school. And from what I understand, you do a lot of work to help other organizations bring to light the history of the African American experience, but more specifically genealogy. How does it play a role to bring awareness and empowerment to our young people? I'm very interested in where our young people are going. So any insight into that, Peyton?
So I think it's an interesting question because I'm 29, and I very rarely ever get asked any question about, so what are the youth doing in the history field, and are they interested in the history field? Particularly with focusing on genealogy, are younger people interested in knowing their history? Is primarily I work with people who are mostly between the ages of 65 and 100, and oftentimes erring on that latter end. I've had the pleasure of speaking to, interviewing, and working with people who were centenarians, and it's wonderful. But I think when it comes to people around my own age bracket and younger, it's an interesting, I think, kind of experience, in part because I think, people are, and I'll just say from my experience, Black youth tend to be extremely in tune with their history. They know where they come from. And there's always, I think, a mixture of pride in where we come from, as well as trying to, I think, navigate the complications of what our history actually means to who we are and what makes us what we are as people. And I feel like I've often got a kind of a foot in the kind of older and younger camp of trying to help people navigate what that means for them. So I think when it comes to actually trying to get people involved in what I do for a profession, primarily it's about making the materials and the processes themselves accessible, and finding ways to get people to see what final products in terms of what genealogical programming can actually look like. And for me, working, for example, I work as a consultant with Preservation Virginia, and I actually got my start as a site historian for Preservation Virginia. And that was right before COVID, actually, midway through 2019. That project that I had been involved in was primarily trying to expand the African American historical interpretation at that plantation site, and doing oral histories, because at that time Preservation Virginia hadn't done any kind of community engagement, community outreach, not a whole lot of oral historical preservation. And so we were starting from basically, step one to re-engage with the community, as the institution. We're actually interested in them, not as historical subjects, but happens to exist within. And in doing that, we were able to, over the past 4 years, as well as historical research, that culminated in a really incredible, just absolutely beautiful permanent gallery piece that is at the plantations, called Bacon's Castle in Surrey. If you have that is able to showcase all of these people's history with all of their family photos and information. And it was nice when we had that gallery showing open last September, and you could see all 4 years of this work go into it, as well as all of this richness of community history be able to be showcased in this one space, and generations of family members being able to see, wow, this is where where my great-great-great-grandparent was, and this is what their experience was, and this is what's post 1865, and they could see the chronological changes. And I think creating these community-based kinds of programs and pieces and exhibitions is a great way to get people to ask for what their family history can look like as a permanent installation within their own community, and also as a means of preserving it as well. And I've seen, younger people become more and more engaged in programs like that, where they can physically see, I think, what their family's histories and legacies actually meant to not just their own families, but the histories of their communities. And I think that that is an absolutely beautiful thing.
Thank you for that. Now, I would hope that our audience tonight can appreciate the talent that we have here tonight. We are getting real close on time here. We're at the 6:30 or so. So we want to move on to the main topic as quickly as we can, which is, what do we do after we do this research? Some ideas and strategies that we can use to help promote the work that we've done. So we'll invite each of our guests in turn to take just a few minutes to explain the ideas, monitor the time, self-monitor your time to leave room for others to talk as well. And we're going to start with Gayle. Gayle, you'll be first, followed by Peyton, then Bettye, and then Leontyne. I'll get that name right.
You got it.
I did it? Okay, thank you. And just let's talk about, to help those that are watching, they spend the hours and probably a lot of frustrations to get to some answers about whether they come from. Once they got that information, what can they do with it? So some ideas and strategies, and Gayle, turn it over to you, and then we just pass it on.
Well, I think the most important thing to do with this is to share it within your family. It's most important to your family. And I'm so glad to hear that Peyton believes that young people are interested in this history. That's wonderful, and that young people are proud of their history. So indeed, it can be frustrating. Many people, Black people, will hit a wall once I guess at that 1870 census, which is the first census after emancipation. It's very difficult to find anything prior to that, but I have. And if I can, then anyone can. I am not a historian. I'm trained as a journalist. My degrees are in communications. The advantage that those degrees gave me is that I'm a relentless individual. And that's one of the skills you have to do this work. You can't quit. You can't give up. And for me, as I'm sure it is for other people, it is among the most important work I've ever done, short of raising a family and caring for my parents, my elderly parents. And I've shared this work and what I've discovered with my family, but I also wrote a book about it. And I didn't mention the name of the book, but I'll take the time to do that right now. It's called Reclamation, Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson, and a Descendant's Search for a Family's Lasting Legacy. I would not recommend that everyone write a book because it will consume much of your life. It will become like giving birth to a child. But I would highly recommend, and Bettye will attest to this, as will Leontyne, because it's very difficult to produce creative work, factual work, but is creative in the process. Share with your family. In addition to that, take some time and join a genealogical group. I see that Shelley Murphy, I took a minute to look at the chat, and I see that Shelley Murphy is on board, Dr. Shelley Murphy. And Shelley Murphy is the director of I think it's called the Descendants Project at UVA, and she does extraordinary work with people and bringing people together and helping people find their roots. And in fact, Shelley Murphy is a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. That's not a club for everybody, but it's part of her legacy, and it's part of a legacy of many Black people claim that legacy. That's why the book is called Reclamation. Go back to those spaces, if you can find them, that where your ancestors were enslaved, and stand on that ground, walk that ground where they were, have that experience, because your ancestors will speak to you through that space. That's what happened to me. That's why I was able to trace this. Every step I took throughout my life brought me to Monticello. I didn't know it. I didn't know it was happening, but I see Leontyne there nodding her head because they move you. They want their stories told. So collect as much as you can and share with your family and go to those spaces. I am a DC girl through and through. I love my hometown, yet here I am living in Charlottesville, Virginia, because my ancestors called me back here, because I needed to walk on that space, because they wanted their stories told and they wanted them shared. Now I'm being called back to Washington, DC, because my mother's family wants her story told. And that's the project I'm working on now. So that's really the most important thing that you can do is collect the information, do the work, go through the pain, enjoy the rewards of it, and share with your family, and then connect with others to share the process that you went through to help them. That's what we're doing tonight. We're doing our best to guide others so they will be inspired to do the work. And that's part of your job as well. And that's how we're not forgotten.
Very good. Thank you for that, Gayle. Peyton, you want to share just a little bit of what you think people can do to motivate others to join them in the search? And
I do, and also I apologize for my internet going out at the absolute perfect time. So we're doing the phone thing, and we're gonna see how that works out. But I do. So I mean, I haven't talked a whole lot about if any, about my own personal ancestry here, and it's part of that is because I'm very proud to come from, in a lot of ways, I think, kind of the average, everyday, working class folks. But there are consequences to that when that comes to actually doing genealogical work. And the reason why I always grew up with stories from my grandfather always telling me from the folks we had who fought in nearly every war in the 20th century to my great 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 grandmother who was bootlegged and kind of cool, and I'm real proud of it. But those stories were always just a picture of what it was like to grow up in my family. And I think, especially after my grandfather's passing, sometimes I wonder if I had taken them for granted. And I remember when I got into this Ph.D. program, which I told my great grandmother like maybe a month before COVID. It was right before COVID I found out. She had said, I didn't know that we could do all of these things. She was the first time she'd ever told me that she had worked as a maid to put her family, through. And she told me it was why she needed to have both of her knees replaced. And I've worked I used to work in warehousing before I became a historian, and I worked 6-7 days a week when I was getting my first master's degree. And the reason why I mention all of that is because what instilled in me and what I try to instill in other people when it comes to preserving your family histories is these are the things that make you who you are. But you also, I think, the communities that you come from should be benefiting, hopefully, from the things that you learn. So for my own family, I've become the designated historian, which is fair, absolutely fair, because I wouldn't be anywhere near this position without them at all whatsoever, and I'm grateful for that. But working with other communities, just being able to find ways to make the material accessible. I've taught people how to navigate county archives, finding ways to maximize the usefulness of ancestry.com or other materials like that, and find ways to be able to share them with your community. Be that I've heard of people doing them in church sermons and services, programs that you can share on site, materials you just email. So I'm in other people's family emails of just people sharing the things that they just happen to find. People sharing materials during family reunions. Finding any way to just continue the conversation, I think, is the best way to keep people alert and aware of the constant importance of the material that you're trying to preserve, because I think that, you know, oral histories is not just about, you know, asking somebody, can you tell me your history so I can put it in this museum program so I can do my job? It's not about that. It's about trying to find ways to honestly, I think, take advantage of the cultural things we already have. So verbally sharing things with other people, you know, whether that is through, you know, just talking about it, singing about it, preaching about it. I mean, keeping it alive in those ways and sharing it as those different kinds of stories, I think is the best way to keep it moving and keep it going.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Who's next? Lost my list. Bettye, I think you were up next.
I think so, but I wasn't sure. Well, in terms of what's next after doing the research, actually continuing the research that my mother had started, and I mentioned that she asked me to write a book, and which I did. It's called The Other Madisons: The Lost History of a President's Black Family. And that's the title, but the story, the history is not really lost. I just want to emphasize that. It's just that it's what the publisher insisted upon. Sometimes we have fights with publishers, sometimes we win, and sometimes we lose. I did win on the cover because the first cover that they gave me was really stereotypic and not representatives of the strengths, you know, that my ancestors had, particularly the women. It showed them as kind of meek mammy figures, and that's really not who my enslaved ancestors were. But anyway, I won on the cover, and I'm really proud of the cover now. I lost on the subtitle, but that's okay, because I know that the stories are not lost. So the message of the book is that enslaved people were remarkable individuals who possessed inner strength and a sense of hope and many talents by which they contributed mightily to every way you can imagine. And most important is that when enslaved people died, they did not take those qualities to the grave with them. They passed them down to us alive today and to future generations as well. But it's a book, and not everybody is a reader. But the message is important nonetheless. I have a 37-minute documentary, and that serves to put my family's story in historical context. And again, to show how the qualities that our enslaved ancestors have are alive in us today. Then I did a TED Talk, which is the most fun thing ever. And it was called Say I Am. And it says that we say I am because we know, our enslaved people know, and we know that our lives are ours because I am. We are much more than property. Then I'm working on a feature film, which is in the future for sure. But again, the message will be the same. Enslaved people passed down to us remarkable qualities that we should recognize, nurture, embrace, share, make sure that they're never forgotten.
That's very good. It takes a lot of energy, and you were a practicing physician in the midst of all of this, no?
I was the beginning. I retired in 2014, but I began in 1990. So that I did a lot of it. So Gayle mentioned that she worked on her research for 50 years. I don't know that I worked on my research for 50 years, but I did work on writing this book for 30 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what most of you are saying is not an overnight experience, right? You got to be ready for the long haul.
Not at all. Not at all. You know, it's an important journey that we all have to take, because we all need to grow. And in order to tell my family's story the way it should be told, I had to grow.
Fantastic. Leontyne, time is yours. Would love to hear from you.
Okay. In terms of what's next, I have always thought that this journey has been a journey of divine discovery, that those ancestors of ours, they're tying together the pieces of history that were lost. So for example, Bettye and Gayle and I are all part of the Descendant community. And James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and Henry Clay, they were all friends. And so it would stand to reason that not only are we descendants of people who were Europeans, but people who were Africans and enslaved there. So we have two histories going on within our families, and there are other families as well. So I don't believe that anything is by accident. While Gayle and I, also her son and I, are both Clay descendants. And Gayle and I met years ago, and she said, "You remind me of someone." And as it turned out, it was her former husband, her son's father. And we didn't know at that time. So that's the ancestors whispering. Bettye and I met years ago at Montpelier. So our ancestors are moving us to a place of understanding and reconnection. It is a discovery, and it's a divine discovery. I call it revelation and restoration, that we're in a revelation and restoration era. When I did the research for my family, I didn't think I was going to be writing a book or be with this for very long. But the first book that I wrote was principally for my family. And it was called Silver Children. It was published in 2006. And the reason that I wrote it was because I didn't want to forget, didn't want to forget anything, but I wanted to share my experience with not only my family, but with other people who were like me, not historians, not really researchers, to say you can do this too. So if we fast forward to 2023, one of the reasons that I really wanted to do, and initially it was going to be a 30-minute documentary, was because of new media. People now sometimes they don't want to take time to read a book. But if you give them a film, or if you give them a trailer, if you give them something small, they'll start out with that, and then they may move on to the book. So that was one, and it took about a year to complete the film Clay 1613. Again, initially it was going to be just a 30-minute film. It ended up being an hour. It's a teaching tool that can be preserved, that can tell about our family, but also it pulls together our brokenness. And that's where those whispers come from. So as Gayle was saying, she started a 50-year journey. Well, my journey started in the 4th grade, so probably over 50 years, when I saw the picture of Senator Henry Clay. And I thought, well, he has to be related to me somehow. And my 4th grade teacher said, I don't know if he's related to you or not. And as it turns out, when we did the DNA and when we did exhaustive research, we are related. But also doing that family history, finding out that you're related to someone like Muhammad Ali. In many cases, when we're doing this history, those things are fun. We have, each family has their story, and you never think about, oh, okay, Muhammad Ali was Cassius Clay. Is he related to me, or is it just, do we just share the same surname? There is power in connecting with our long lost relatives. Part of the film, for those of you who have seen it, you know, and hopefully more people will see it, is I didn't know when I did the research that Muhammad Ali had a brother who lives in Louisville named Rockman. I didn't know he had a brother. And when we did the DNA test, we matched and we met, and we both felt that our ancestors had been separated. So while he had his family in Louisville and mine was principally in Virginia, could have been two sisters, two brothers separated. So this divine discovery is to put us back together. It started over 25, 30 years ago, and now we have media, we have researchers, we have a tremendous interest of people for restoration. That's the power of these stories. And I would be remiss if I wouldn't, didn't say that all of the ties that we have, they're giving us courage when we look at MDC, at Montpelier. Bettye eloquently, described what was going on there. The ancestors were with us fighting that journey to preserve the history of the enslaved. And it takes a lot of courage, a lot of dedication, and long term. So my next steps for me personally, my husband says, we got to get on with this. You can't be bringing all this stuff back in the bedroom, all these books and notes and on the bed and in the room. So my next step, I don't want my 20 years of research to be lost. And because I'm a native of West Virginia, I'm working with West Virginia University and the West Virginia Regional History Society, I think it's called the Society, to dedicate and to donate all of my research materials, all of them, to that research repository. Because my daughters, although they've been along with this journey with me, they're not going to know what to do with this stuff, and it might end up in the landfill. I can't trust them to preserve it. So I'm very happy that I have a partner that says we want to take this information. It's important. And then future generations can, they'll be able to hopefully benefit from the work that I've done. So for next steps for me, it's making sure that our information is preserved.
Well, I tell you, this has really been fascinating. I wish we could go on for another hour, but we want to get time in for some questions and answers. And before Ashley join in, I personally just want to say thank you to each of the panelists. I'm just fascinated, and I will be reaching out to each of you in the future. I will get back to Montpelier and been to Charlottesville several times. I agree with you. I could talk for a long time about our ancestors are up there with a giant chessboard, moving things around because they want to be remembered. They want to be discovered. I believe that with all my heart. If I had time, I'll tell y'all a story about Franklin, Tennessee. I had a very unique experience about events in Franklin, Tennessee. So I'm convinced. Again, thank you, Library of Virginia, for asking me to host. And we'll turn the time over to Ashley to do quick Q&A.
Thank you, everyone. Our first question, I'm going to open it up to the group. For beginners, what suggestions should we use in beginning our search?
I would say start with the oldest person in your family. Take a a recorder, take your phone, take some notes, and just start to casually, you can arrange to have some tea or cookies or dinner and start having those oral histories shared with you by the elders in your family. That's what I would say.
I agree with that. And I think it would also be valuable to get a membership with something like Ancestry.com and Ancestry DNA. And just to add in, to contribute to what you said, Leontyne, about the ancestors. It's just give me 1 second, please. They do call us to do this work. And I just heard Stuart mention Franklin, Tennessee. Well, guess what? The story I'm working on now takes me back to Franklin, Tennessee. And I know almost nothing about that place, but I'm getting that tingling sensation I got when I was working on my book. They're telling us something. They want us to get these stories out. Through Ancestry DNA, I met my cousin, who is director now of the Getting Word Oral History Project. I did not know this young man. He's a brilliant young man, but he's there now to continue telling these stories and to archive these stories. As you mentioned, Leontyne, we can all have our stories archived. We have to do the work, we have to ask the questions, and we have to listen to our ancestors because they are talking to us all the time. We just have to be open to it. I'm sorry, Bettye. Go ahead. I'm done.
I was just going to add a little bit on to what Leontyne was suggesting. And to ask those elders in our family, what do they have in the back of their closets and in their basements and attics? And, there's all kinds of like old letters, photographs, buttons. Those are all part of the story.
And if I could just add one thing too, I have very few regrets in my life, but the one I do have is when we moved my parents out of their home where they've lived for about 60 years. I was so exhausted. Both my parents were ill. I'd cleaned up a lot. My sister and my brother helped, my sisters. By the time we got to the attic and I was pulling out, my mother had a phenomenal wardrobe. Much of it was in the attic. By the time I was done pulling out her fur coats and everything else she'd stuck up there because she was sick of it, I was tired. So I gave somebody else the responsibility of finishing that work in the attic. Every day, I'm reminded of that and regret that. So Bettye, you are so right. Fortunately, there were some things we salvaged, but who knows what was lost up there? A treasure trove. There's a treasure trove in those spaces. So absolutely, don't throw out anything. Don't leave that to someone else.
Send the kids to find them. You don't have to go into the basement. Get the kids involved.
I did want to say super quickly, for people who don't have elders to get stories from. So for example, I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina. I grew up in Northern Virginia, and I've lived in Richmond for the last 11 years. And it wasn't until I've been living here for about maybe 4 or 5 years before my mother had said, by the way, did you know your great-great-grandfather was from Richmond, lived in the Monroe Ward? Actually turned out that his father and I lived on the exact same street, and I had found his old address from 1934, that at the exact same time I'd found it, I'd been living on the same street that he had been living on 80 plus years in the past. And I think some good tools to think about if you don't have access to your relatives, for any reason, or older relatives who know information. So for example, in my family, there isn't anybody else really living in Richmond. So and there aren't a whole lot of people who are alive to know anybody from Richmond, because primarily most everybody left and moved up to New York during the Great Migration in the mid-30s. So Family Search, which is a free tool, is a good tool to use if you don't have access to ancestry.com, although that it is a good resource. Learning how to navigate the census is a really good research tool. Also, by the way, if you start with yourself and you know who your parents' names, or your grandparents' names, and starting to work your way back through census records is really helpful. A lot of those resources, including Family Search and Ancestry.com, have census records as well as Social Security marriage records, marriage licenses, birth records, death records. Oftentimes your local larger scale libraries, obviously like the Library of Virginia in Virginia, this is a good tool to use. Cemetery records are good tools to use, because oftentimes when you're doing genealogy, it's, especially when you're from a minority group, it's oftentimes an issue of reconstructing rather than saying, hey, I can figure out where my family member was in 1450 in England. A lot of us don't necessarily have that ability or privilege, or however you would want to describe that. So finding those ways to reconstruct people who are part of your ancestry is a good way of kind of putting those building blocks together. And it can take a very long time, because even in Richmond, I have been doing my genealogy for Richmond for the last several years. And my grandmother, who's still living, was raised by her grandfather, who was my great grandfather, who was born here in 1900. And if I ask her what, you remember anything about his time in Richmond, she said, nope. I asked him when we watched Roots in 1970, he just grunted and refused to talk about anything. And oftentimes, and I mean, in my own work, there is definitely, I think, a generational issue. Oftentimes, I mean, sometimes it's trauma, sometimes it's other issues, particularly with Gen X generation and Boomer generation. If you want to ask, oftentimes there are people who really don't, generations that didn't want to share difficult information with their own relatives. And so oftentimes once it gets to either millennials or Gen Z or what have you, it's trying to reconstruct those gap areas where people either felt like they couldn't speak, didn't want to speak, or weren't allowed to speak for whatever reason. So I would keep that in mind if that is the kind of thing that applies to you. But any of these free resources are good. And also Ashley can, if y'all want, my email, if you have any questions about how to access materials, be that local county-based or larger scale state-based, even if you're not from Virginia, I'd be happy to answer those questions further too.
And I'm happy to pass along Peyton's email to everyone. And there has been a general question of, is this program being recorded? And the answer is yes. And we will make this available on the library's social media platforms, as well as our YouTube channel. The next question is possibly open to everyone. Have you ever seen situations where ancestors are missing from the 1870 census?
Is that just by just completely missing, or name changes, or?
I don't know, but I think probably giving an answer to both, Peyton, it looks like you have the answer, would be the best possibility.
Okay. So, I mean, I have in my work where, and that is not super uncommon, where people should be somewhere and they were living in a county in a particular decade. Sometimes though, I mean, so we're talking about 1870 and people still going door to door and guessing how to spell someone's name. So sometimes if that person was not home that day, you're not going to be in the census. If you were out of the town, you're not going to, on that particular day, you may not be in the census. It doesn't mean that there isn't some manner of registration or not registration, a residency record of them in the county or locale that they're from. So I would just expand your search and not necessarily look at the census, because the census is just a dot in time that is kind of expansive over a period of a decade, and anything can happen in that decade. So I would look at other materials that might be related to that date. And it would be a little easier, for example, if you can go to the courthouse and look at, for example, tax records are a good way for things in that, that far in the past. Tax records are a good resource, church registries, different kinds of materials like that. But that's what I meant before about, these processes of trying to reconstruct. It may not be as straightforward as being able to say, this person is in the 1870 census, the 1860 census, the 1850 census, but sometimes you gotta be a little, be prepared to be a little bit creative about how you go about finding them. But yeah, definitely look at other kinds of county-based records, and a lot of those you can still find in the courthouse, particularly tax records and tax rolls. Those big books you often see when you go to a county courthouse, those massive books, land and tax rolls and things like that, are a good resource. And oftentimes they're indexed. The index can be a little awkward to sometimes navigate, so definitely ask a court clerk if you're having difficulty navigating, but it's a good resource.
I just want to mention the family stories. My great-great-grandmother refused to speak to the census taker. She had been enslaved, and she didn't trust them. She didn't know why they were approaching her. So that's why she is not in the 1870 census.
Anyone else? Okay, Gayle, I think this one is specifically for you. Was Sally Hemings ever freed?
No, she was not. However, per her agreement with Jefferson, she was, quote, given her time. And what that meant was, after Jefferson's death, which was on July 4th, 1826, 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed, she was allowed to live as a free person in Charlottesville, Virginia, with her two sons on Main Street, which she did until the day she died, and she died in her 50s. If Sally Hemings had been freed, she would have been forced to leave Charlottesville. That was the law. After 1 year of manumission, an enslaved person had to leave, and she wouldn't have wanted to do that. This was the home that she'd known, and this is something that people might want to consider as well. These spaces, these places that we sometimes call prison camps, were actually home to enslaved people. It was what they knew. So they wouldn't have wanted to leave. Even after Monticello was sold, after Jefferson died, some of the enslaved people stayed because they didn't have any place else to go. They weren't sure of their destinies. Of course, they wouldn't have been freed either, but they were sort of, they just didn't have any place else to go. So to answer the question, no, Sally Hemings was not freed, but she was given her time. And when she died, the two children that she lived with, the two sons, moved to Ohio, where they lived as Black people. They lived in the Black community. And then one moved to Wisconsin, where he changed his, does one say this? He didn't change his identity, but he changed his race and became part of the white community and changed his last name to Jefferson rather than Hemings. So you see how nuanced and complicated these stories can be.
Okay, the next question, how do you know when you have enough information to make a film or write a book?
Oh gosh.
No.
I think that for me, writing the book, the first book, Silver Children, when I accumulated enough information going back to the early 1800s, and I thought I need to write this and get it out and get some photographs and, interview a few people. So the first book is a little sketchy just because I wanted to make sure something happened to me. That information will be preserved. And in terms of doing the film, I think sometimes intuitively, you just know this is the right time. this is the right time to tell the story. And then you consult with other people, ask them. And then I just kind of think that you know it's the right time. And it's never easy, because while we have ancestors out there whispering in our ears to say, go ahead, this is the right time, you also have obstacles of people saying, no, it'll cost too much money, or they don't understand the story, or this may be your story, but other people want to, put their story into your story. So there can be some problems there, but I think if you have enough information, enough facts to share, like I have 400 years of history to share. My family was here, Black and white, before the country was a country. So there's a lot of information, to share for me. Now, for other people who came later, you have to decide that yourself, how much time is enough time. But for me, it was when I got to that point, like, I think I have enough to tell the story.
For me, it was fine. Oh, I'm sorry, Gayle.
No, you go ahead, Bettye, please. Go ahead.
For me, it was finally knowing for sure what message I wanted the book to tell. What was the takeaway message? Which I won't repeat, but once I was solid on that, I knew it was time to sit down and write.
And for me, it really was a combination of things. I knew there was a story there. I'm a journalist. I'm trained to write. I knew I had a story I wanted to tell. I've always wanted to tell a story. But it had to be more than just tracing that history. It had to be something that was compelling. It had to hurt. And I had to be willing to dig deep into that hurt and be willing to share. So I wasn't ready until I could be my authentic self and be completely honest and share the hurt that I was experiencing. And that was the pivotal moment. That was when I knew, oh, I have a story to tell, and I have a story that will help other people and help me too, because I had a lot I needed to unload, and I unloaded it in that book. So it was a very emotional thing for me.
Peyton, do you have anything to add?
Well, apart from currently writing my dissertation, I have not written a book. And I haven't participated in making a documentary for the sites that I have worked at, although you've done plenty of news interviews and stories of that nature, which I am extremely happy about. So from that perspective, what I would say is I honestly understand that the question is about larger scale, how much information do you actually need to make an all-encompassing project? But I also don't think there's anything wrong with not having, enough information to write a 300 or 400 page book before you start creating some kind of shareable material about it. So oftentimes the news stories that we've done that I've had the privilege to be a part of are anywhere between 4 and 10 minutes. And those, short sets of time where you can encourage descendants to talk about their histories. I've been a part of some where I shared my own family stories, or communities are being able to find ways to get these platforms to speak in ways where I think their voices are not typically, elevated on a public sphere. Finding ways to elevate that voice on a public sphere in ways that aren't typical are, incredibly impactful and constructive for furthering ways of trying to, I think, publicly express and instill the value of what those historical legacies of those communities and people and ancestors actually is. And I've found that they do a great deal of breaking a lot of walls communally, and getting people encouraged to actually want to listen to things they may not necessarily have been cool with listening to before. Being interested in doing more to preserve their own family histories or their own community spaces. So all of that to say, I think no amount of information is too small to get started.
And I would add to it, it depends on what your objective is. If your objective is to document for your own family, then Peyton is absolutely right. Nothing is too small. If your objective is to get published, well, that's a whole different ballgame. And that's, again, that involves a lot more than just telling your own personal story. It has to have something that, as my editor told me, there has to be something in it for the reader. And that makes it very complex and very demanding and very hard. And again, the most important objective, I think, is to tell a story that is of value to you and to your family and to your descendants, so that they don't have to struggle the way we had to struggle to collect these stories. It's right there for them. And that could be 5 pages long. That could just be a listing of your family tree, or it could be a booklet. It doesn't have to be a whole book. It just needs to be a recollection for your descendants.
Also, I think it's a restoration for your spirit, because it's hard work, and it can be very painful, and it can be isolating, but we still have to tell the stories. And when I think about all of our ancestors who endured and labored through much more difficult times than we did, we're still them, and we still have to tell their stories, and it can be a very painful journey, but a necessary journey.
Amen. It is restorative. If you just do it for yourself, you can just do it for yourself. It's worth it.
We're going to take 2 more questions. And Gayle, this one is for you. I was born and raised in Jamaica and was spiritually led to Virginia and to visit Monticello, where I feel a strong connection. What steps can I take to start our conversation at Monticello?
So when you say you feel a strong connection, I'm assuming you feel a strong connection to the ancestors, and you feel that you are possibly descendant from that community, in which case I would highly recommend you get in touch with, if you get in touch with me, I'll put you in touch with the right people. And that can be reached at gjwhite@monticello.org. As I said, we have something called the Getting Word Oral History Project. And I would be happy to put you in touch with, we have a phenomenal staff to connect you with that staff, so you can begin traveling that journey, so we can find out how you're related.
All right, on our last question, is there a repository for contributing names of enslaved people listed in wills that you find? This may help someone else's research.
I didn't hear the question. Sorry.
Sorry, is there a repository for contributing names of enslaved people listed in wills that you find? This may help someone else's research. Like, is there a website
Peyton?
that you can add all these names to?
Peyton, can you answer that?
So I can. So there is one in the works, although depending on where you live or where you're working at or focused on in terms of your research, there are quite a few counties and institutions, libraries, and historians that will have those, and oftentimes they're digitized. But the larger scale would probably be enslaved.org. But that is also an ongoing process where a lot of historical sites are putting in information that is related to their particular historical site and people who were enslaved on those places. So you could look there, you could look, but again, I mean, at least at this time, there's actually going and looking at will books is oftentimes I don't want to say the easiest, but the somewhat quickest way of being able to find people. But obviously that depends on accessibility for you. Now, what I will say though is that if you, for example, like my family was enslaved in Amelia County, it is not uncommon that particular courthouses will have either on-site genealogists or people who work part-time or as volunteers as genealogists who you can call for, call court clerk offices, and they can sometimes help you actually either find information that can be sent to you from a courthouse. So in that kind of situation, it very much is like a shake a hand, make a friend kind of situation, and be comfortable calling courthouses and other municipal places like that to see if they can look through the will book for you. So yeah, so I mean, it's very like I do apologize for the kind of yes and no answer, but that is the reality of it right now. What enslaved.org will look like 10 years from now will probably be much more expansive. But right now that's still in progress.
Well, thank you to the wonderful panelists for this evening and our wonderful moderator. And I want to say thank you to you all for joining us. And if you have any questions and you're looking for this recording, please check out the Library of Virginia's website, our social media platforms, as well as our newsletters and broadside. So thank you all and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.